She thought instead with longing of more books, of buying books, of slipping into a narrative of other people's lives. That was release. Hello and welcome to part 3 of my exploration of horror from the 1970s. In this video, I will be focusing specifically on horror books that came out at the end of the decade, the years 77, 78, and 79. There will be killer kids. Of course, this is the 70s, right? There will be a killer dog, evil hippies, Vietnam War veterans suffering from PTSD, a family curse, plenty of alcoholics, and parents with absolutely no interest in parenting, and of course, more killer kids. Welcome to the 70s, right? I've prepared a short montage featuring some cool book covers from the 1970s and featuring the music of a classic 70s composition by Estonian composer Arvo Pärt. And I'll see you on the other side to talk about some great and important work. And even sick, evil, disturbing things like the 1970s must come to an end, sadly. Horror would continue on into the 1980s and beyond, of course, and even thrive. But it wouldn't be easy. Kids were losing their telekinetic powers. We were promised the rise of Satan, but had to contend instead with the rise of Reagan and Thatcher, which arguably just as evil, but inarguably significantly less cool. Disco was dead, and how can we have horror without disco, right? Well, we'd manage, but it wouldn't be the same. No, the end of the 1970s would mark a seismic shift in horror, a twilight, a dusk, a line of demarcation between two very different eras in horror. And this turning point, which is the late 1970s, is due to two significant factors. Firstly, Stephen King. Stephen King came on the scene in 1974 with Carrie, which was big, right? And he would follow up the success of Carrie with Salem's Lot in 1975 and The Shining in 1977, and hit after hit after hit, and so on, right? And what Stephen King did for horror, or what his books did, his books did something that was quite unique in that they featured kids as main characters, but kids in the 70s was nothing new, except before Stephen King, kids were the source of the terror. But Stephen King, kids were the heroes, right? And they were the ones who were fighting the terror. Even his first book, Carrie, a teenager, she is the killer, but she's also sympathetic, right? She's also the heroine in a way. And all the other characters are high school aged as well. And not all of his books feature predominantly high school kids or adolescents, but a lot of them did. And in also the writing style, King made horror accessible to younger readers, to teenagers and younger teenagers especially. And in the 70s, the late 1970s, YA, or young adult as a genre, was just starting to become a thing, a really important genre in publishing. You could argue that YA started to become a thing in the 1960s, going back as far as 1962's A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. And at that time, when that book came out, publishers and booksellers, they didn't know what to do with that book. They said, is this for adults? Is it for children? We don't know. We'll put it out there and see what happens. And it was a massive hit. Some argue that A Wrinkle in Time would be the first YA novel of all time. You could also make a case for 1967's The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. And with The Outsiders, there was no ambiguity as to who this book was created for, who it was targeted at, and who it was marketed to. The book features almost exclusively teenage characters dealing with teenage themes, and written in a style that made it very accessible and appealing to readers of that age. And it was also a massive hit. And then in the 70s, Judy Blume came along, and YA really became an important part of publishing. It became a genre in and of itself. But YA didn't involve horror. No, horror was for adults. If kids or teenagers wanted horror, they could read the classics or fairy tales. But no, horror was for adults. And then Stephen King came along, and that changed, and it changed dramatically. This shift in demographics of horror was also aided by another arrival in the late 70s, early 80s, and that was the home box office. Cable television, the home box office channel, HBO, and the invention of the VCR, video cassette recorder. So now people could experience horror movies without going to the cinema. And actually, if you were to go to the cinema, you had to be at least 17 or 16 to legally get into the cinema to see these horror movies. But the end of the 70s, early 80s, horror became accessible to a younger demographic through home movie entertainment. In fact, my introduction to horror was probably the same as many other people in my age group, which was through movies. And those movies I saw at home. The Exorcist, or I think, yeah, The Exorcist might have been the first horror movie I ever saw. Obviously, I did not see it in the cinema, I saw it at home. So horror was becoming more and more accessible to a younger audience, and horror writers, thanks to Stephen King, were making horror that was accessible to younger readers, and they were all having massive success with it. For me, as an adult, I have a preference for horror written for adults, which is one of the reasons why I love the 1970s so much. Really, 1970 up to 1977, more or less. Because most of the horror books from that time featured characters who were adults, and if there were children, those children were the killers and they were evil. They were not the heroes. And the writing style was written for adults. Even though there were horror books written for adults in the 1980s and 90s and so on, not nearly as many percentage-wise as there were prior to the Stephen King and the introduction of the home box office. In fact, this trend, this shift in demographics has continued to this day. The horror books that are being put out today are largely targeted towards younger readers. Not exclusively. There are still some authors who cater to people my age. But I have to wade through a lot of young reader YA horror in order to find something suited for me. In the 1970s, that was much easier to do. Since the late 1970s was a period of transition, a shift in the demographics of horror, like all transitions, there was some awkwardness involved. Stephen King definitely knew what he was doing, writing for these young readers, but the publishers and writers who wanted to copy his style or his template, share in his success, not all of them knew quite how to go about it, which led to the creation of some pretty strange works of horror in the late 1970s. We'll take a look at a few examples of those and also some more traditional 1970s horror, beginning with Hellhound by Ken Greenhall from 1977. Hellhound is Ken Greenhall's follow-up to his debut, Elizabeth, which I talked about in part 2 of this series. Hellhound is about a dog named Baxter. And Baxter, according to the book, is a very ugly dog. But it's not what's on the outside that counts, it's what's on the inside. And on the inside, Baxter wants nothing more than to kill babies and kill old people. So yeah, he's ugly on the inside too. But Baxter doesn't kill people the way you would think a dog would kill people. He doesn't maul them or tear at their throats with his sharp teeth and his strong jaws. No, Baxter is a clever little canine, isn't he? He kills people in a way that makes it look like an accident. Like he pushes an infant or pushes a toddler into a swimming pool and watches her drown. And then when she's dead, he sounds the alarm, barking until someone comes. However, his lust for murder is such that he ends up killing the humans that take care of him. So he's passed from one owner to another in the same neighborhood. And no one suspects that Baxter is a serial killer. No one except a young boy in the neighborhood. And this young boy, he sees Baxter, he recognizes the darkness in the dog, and he identifies it because he himself feels this darkness, right? And he thinks, wouldn't it be great to have a serial killer dog as a pet? Think of all the dark fun we could have, right? So he convinces his parents to take in Baxter as their pet. But Baxter, he's on to the kid. He knows what the kid's thinking. And Baxter is a serial killer. And you know how it is with serial killers. They prefer to work alone. So inevitably, there will be a standoff between Baxter and this young boy. Hellhound is an inventive book with a large part of the story told from Baxter's perspective. It's quite a bit darker than Elizabeth. And there is a French movie adaptation of Hellhound called Baxter. I've seen clips of it on YouTube, and I get the impression that it is significantly darker than the book. The book has a bit of camp to it, at least the first half of the book. It's true that the second half, when Baxter is united with this kid, there it gets a bit dark, right? But Hellhound is worth checking out. It's unique and well done, and the story and the conflicts it presents are intriguing, I think. Next up is Suffer the Children by Saul, also from 1977. Suffer the Children was Saul's first book, and it was quite successful. It is also one of the strangest books I have ever read. The story itself is not that strange, but it's the tone of the book that is so bizarre. There's this guy, right? He's the father of two young girls. And he takes one of the girls into the woods, and then he has an episode. He doesn't know why, he really can't remember, but he ends up just violently beating this girl, his daughter. And he knows what he did, but he can't really remember it. And the whole town knows. A year later, when a lot of children start going missing, the chief of police kind of insinuates that maybe he should be considered a suspect in these disappearances. And the guy tells his secretary about this, and she flips out. She says, "Oh, how dare he? How dare the police? Just because you beat up your daughter. That was over a year ago and you only did it once. It's not like you sexually assaulted her or anything. Oh, the nerve of them. Can't they just get over it, right? And every character has this cavalier, super casual attitude towards children going missing and this guy beating up his daughter. It's super weird. It's so strange, the tone, that it's borders on parody, but it doesn't go over the top enough. It just sits at that really odd place of being incomprehensible, but at the same time coherent throughout the story and through all the characters. Super weird. The story itself centers around a family curse, the death of a small girl, and her possible haunting or possession of other children in the town. It's never quite explained exactly, and I think the ambiguity works well for the story. It creates a mystery aspect that kept me turning the pages. The book has a killer kid. It has children being killed, and quite brutally too. It has a cat killed and brutalized. It has a tea party with corpses. And no one in this story wants to take any action or take any responsibility for children going missing or for what's going on in this town, which allows for the horror to unfold with really no interruption. I saw an interview with Saul on YouTube where he talks about Suffer the Children. And he says that he sent his agent a manuscript about a gay Jewish couple or something like that. And his agent said, what am I supposed to do with this? I can't sell this. And his agent told him, why don't you write a book like Stephen King? That I can sell. So Saul said, who's Stephen King, right? So he went to the bookshop, and Salem's Lot had just come out. So he bought a copy of Salem's Lot and read it, and did some research on Stephen King, and he said, oh, okay, I can do that. To give you an idea of where the publishing industry was headed at that time. So he wrote Suffer the Children. I don't think he quite nailed the Stephen King charm, tone. I can see that he went for it, but it's a pretty awkward result, albeit a successful one. I'd be curious to read more books from Saul to see if he eventually got a better handle on this kind of horror for kids vibe, or if he just liked his own weird take on it and just kept in that vein. As I continue on into the 1980s with this video series, probably, I'm sure that I will get an opportunity to read more of Saul's work. In Suffer the Children, the horror or the evil force and how it interacts with people and what its true motivation is never really fleshed out enough to make for a truly satisfying horror story, for me at least. I would still recommend Suffer the Children, mainly for its odd tone, and it's a bit of a curiosity, and for that I think it's worth checking out. Next up, The Totem by David Morrell from 1979. David Morrell is the author of First Blood from 1972, book that spawned the movie franchise Rambo. And First Blood is the book that started it all, a book I was very impressed with. And a few years later, the mid-late 1970s, David Morrell wrote a few horror books. He wrote the Testament in 1975, and this one, The Totem, in 1979. So I went into this book with very high expectations, having loved First Blood, right? And The Totem was exactly what I expected. It's a well-written action horror, well-paced with compelling and well-fleshed-out characters. Like First Blood, in The Totem, there are Vietnam War veterans suffering from PTSD. He explores also the conflict between hippies or the counterculture movement and conservatives, and he's sympathetic to both sides. There's a vigilante mob of rifle-wielding ranchers who go up to the mountains to hunt down these crazy virus-infected hippies, right? There's quite a bit of gore with a high body count, but it favors action over creepiness or scares. Now, action horror is not a genre that I have explored much. This book reminded me a bit of Carry On Comfort by Dan Simmons. However, I preferred the Totem, to be honest with you. I didn't love it as much as I loved First Blood, but then again, I went into First Blood with no expectations, and I went into the Totem with very high expectations, and I was satisfied. So if action horror is a genre that you're particularly interested in, I would give the Totem a high recommendation. Some other notable horror books that came out in the late 1970s. These presented as a non-fiction account. For more of a novel type version of this story, you're better off with the sequel. The Howling by Gary Brandner. I have not read this one. As I understand it, the book begins with a rape and then turns into a werewolf story with graphic sex and gore. That does not sound appealing to me, but it is somewhat of a classic that started a trilogy, or that became a trilogy. The Shining by Stephen King, which is about a possessed fire hose and a caretaker's battle with a hotel boiler, and you've probably read it. The sequel, Dr. Sleep, is grossly underrated in my opinion. The Nightwalker by Thomas Tessier, an American Vietnam War vet living in London suffering from PTSD and unhealthy, even unhuman urges. Here's an excerpt from a review that I feel is indicative of how many readers feel about this. Quote, "There are some really interesting elements here, including the Vietnam War, voodoo in Guadeloupe, punks in London, and a clairvoyant and a werewolf. But at times the story felt somewhat fragmented, some violent and sexual content. Those sections in particular were excellently written. Overall, it was a good read, and I am interested to read more of Tessier's work." Also, from the late 1970s, Ghost Story by Peter Straub from 1979. This is considered a classic. I didn't talk about it in this video series because I couldn't think of anything positive to say about it. I am baffled as to why so many people love this book, but they do. And here is an extract from a 5-star review. "Things aren't quite what they seem, and isn't it marvelous? Looking for a thrilling read that will ever so slowly freeze your blood without attempting to shock with gratuitous gore and schlock tactics? Then line up. Peter Straub's Ghost Story has what you need right here." So I've come to the end of my exploration of horror from the 1970s. In preparation for making these videos, I read a lot of great and interesting books. I also read a lot of not so great and interesting books. But because I am obsessed with making lists and ranking things, I will be putting out my personal ranking of my favorite, or my top 10 favorite horror books from the 1970s. What are some of your favorite books from this decade? Do you have any experience with the books I talked about in this video? Should I continue on into the 1980s? I probably will, but should I be as wary as I am, or as skeptical about the quality I'm going to find in horror in the 1980s? Should I be that skeptical? I will have a lot of reading to do should I decide to continue with this series into the 1980s. So if you have a recommendation for adult horror from the early part of the 1980s, I'm making a list and I would greatly appreciate your input. Thank you for watching. I'll see you at the next video.